Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us for the first of our CPD sessions in history. We're delighted to welcome Claire Strickland, who's Head of Pastoral at the Dragon School in Oxford, and a historian who's part of our setting team. These sessions have been devised to support you delivering the new specifications for CE, with this session tonight focusing on equity, diversity and inclusion. Our aim at ISEB is to evolve our assessments, and in these sessions we hope to demonstrate how CE can also support cross-curricular and thematic learning. So we'll be exploring that in our next session with lead setter Bob Pace. Make sure you sign up on Eventbrite for that next history session in June. There's currently an early bird discount too if you book soon. Once Claire's session has finished, there will be time for questions, so please use the chat function that you can see in YouTube. Now, if you aren't logged into Google or to YouTube, you should log in if you want to get access to that chat function. I'll make a note of your questions throughout the session and we'll make sure they're all answered in our Q&A for you later. So a very quick reminder, all good YouTube channels need to do it. A reminder to find us on social media. We have new social media channels this year, so you can find us at ISEB Awards on all channels. But without much further ado, I'm really pleased to hand you over to Claire Strickland.
Right, welcome to this afternoon's webinar where we're going to be focusing on equality, diversity and inclusion in the ISEB Common Entrance curriculum. We're going to explore why EDI is important and how we can integrate it into your teaching through topics, techniques and specific examples of focus. So without further ado, we're going to have a look at the presentation. So equality, diversity and inclusion are so important as we live and operate in an increasingly diverse society globally, and that diversity and inclusion is a moral and a legal imperative that actually concerns us all. So for this webinar, we're going to be talking about EDI in the curriculum, but we also need to remember that EDI is an important part of our pedagogy, and we should be integrating that into our teaching methods and practices for every lesson. So why is it important to embed EDI in the curriculum? Engaging learners by showing how and what we're teaching can be applied to solve real life problems. We're helping them to develop personal and social skills that will be useful for them in the workplace and also in social situations. We also have to remember that we need to demonstrate also to the ISI inspectors that we're promoting equality and diversity through our teaching and learning. So what barriers are there to this? And you'll probably find in your various departments, you might get members of staff saying, oh, equality and diversity, not that old chestnut again. Oh, it's really hard to fit everything in without finding time for equality and diversity as well. Teaching equality, diversity isn't my job. Or I teach everyone equally. I don't know why they say there's no evidence of E&D in my lesson plans or schemes of work. I look at it and do things differently if I need to. Or there aren't any opportunities for building EDI into my subject. So I want to actually talk about why we as historians should be embedding it in our curriculum. Well, it helps pupils gain a coherent knowledge and understanding of their country's past and that of the wider world. How people's lives have shaped their history and how their country has influenced and been influenced by the wider world. It also should inspire pupils' curiosity to know more about the past. Teaching should equip pupils to ask perceptive questions, think critically, weigh evidence, sift arguments, and develop perspective and judgment. But it also helps pupils understand the connections between local, regional, national, and international history, between cultural, economic, military, political, religious, and social history, and between short and long-term timescales. So there is a need to create the big picture of history by learning about the diverse experiences of people within and between societies as a matter of course, in order to provide an holistic understanding of the past. Hilary Clare wrote back in 1996, and I think it's still relevant today, in an inclusive curriculum, there are good reasons for not treating race, gender, and class separately, not just to match the real world, but also to avoid the danger of creating hierarchies or forgetting links. This requires providing children with a chronological, secure knowledge of the past, together with teaching British, local, and world history as a structure for understanding the past. At the same time, it requires us to consider people in these islands together and those from different localities and the nations of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, and other parts of the world. Diversity requires us to consider strands such as gender, the poor, the rich, and the experience of people from different ethnicities within society by acknowledging links, similarities, and differences between all of these dimensions. It is also possible for us to provide a basis for pupils to identify different aspects of the past and also to use it as a background to understanding the world that they actually live in. Later, we'll look at a course on the Black Tudors and the role of women in the English Civil War.
Why study history? What's the point? How does learning about the past affect my life right now? Well, my friends, those are all excellent questions which millions of people around the world have asked at some point in their lives. The answer might be surprising, because in the end, the answer is always you. Let's start with an important distinction. The past refers to everything that's happened up until this moment. History is a record of past events. When we study the past, we examine pictures, letters, videos, legal documents, and much more, which give us glimpses into other time periods. But why study history at all, you're wondering? What does it all have to do with me? George Santayana said, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it." It's a powerful lesson, but it's not the full story. See, humans are creatures of habit who have a tendency of making the same mistake over and over again. Think about it. How many times have you promised yourself you'd get your work done well before the deadline, yet find yourself working furiously the day before it's due? Each time you tell yourself that next time you'll do things differently, yet you never quite learn the lesson. Alright, so maybe it's hard for humans to learn from their mistakes. So why study history? It can be said that we learn about history in order to understand how to become a change champion, someone who finds a way to break the pattern and create change in their community. History is full of inspirational leaders who teach us about standing up for our beliefs. But that's still not the whole story. History doesn't involve simply learning about the big mistakes or the change champions. History is filled with larger-than-life characters who take on a starring role in history books. These people use their power, good or evil, to create change, but they are nothing without the ordinary people who support them. You see, history is so much more than wars and empires and famous buildings. It's about his story and her story and their story. We study history to learn about how the deeds of ordinary people shaped the lives of other ordinary people, and how their lives were affected by other ordinary people, and so on. When we study the past, we are studying the decisions and daily lives of individual people whose actions contributed to what we call history. That's where you come in. Every action you make and every word you speak becomes part of something bigger than you can possibly imagine. We learn about history because it's his story and her story and their story and your story. So why study history? Look around. You're in the middle of creating it right now. Study the past, so that the history you're writing today is something worth learning about tomorrow.
So we also need to remember that the Equalities Act of 2010 also provides protection from discrimination, and it's useful to have those 9 protected characteristics in mind as you plan your curriculum. So how to teach EDI? How can we plan for this? Well, we're using our history teaching tools. So looking at narrative, the stories, looking at evidence base, looking at a series of sources and discussing whether they would reflect life today in Britain. Projects are an excellent way of doing this. We do an excellent project on the slave trade. We do one on the Romans. We do one on women in the 19th century as well. Essays, debate, motion. Historians are impartial in their recording of history is a really good topic to actually have as a discussion. Or hot seating. What power did women have in the medieval times? Getting the children really to think about history as empathy, putting them back into that time and think about what it would have been like. And role playing. What was it like for a Norman to settle in England? And making some of those comparisons as well with the modern world so that they really, really understand that the history then still has relevance today. So in your planning, we really do need to consider the following: ensuring that the children have the opportunity to study a range of people's experiences within topics. So men, women, people from different ethnicities, regions, localities. We do often focus on Mary Seacole as well as Florence Nightingale, but in a minute we're going to look at John Blank, Pablo Fanck, who's a really interesting character who actually owned a circus and was a black man really fighting against prejudice in the sort of 19th century. The Crusades, the Pilgrim Fathers. There's some really, really good topics out there where you can really show how EDI can be integrated and really raise the awareness so that children are really, really conscious of their own lives now and how they respond to each other. I did an interesting experiment the other day. We were talking about gender equality and stereotyping, and I put on the board just words like arrogant, mentally weak, sporty. And I put all these words on the board and I had women, both men. And I said, don't put down what you expect me you expect me to think. Put down what you think. And it was really interesting having a discussion afterwards because there is still some gender stereotyping going on. Most of the girls put their hands up when it said about, never cry. Well, boys never cry. Well, that's not true. And when we discussed it, they said, no, you're right. They do cry. But actually, it was just the perception out there. So it was just a really good way of talking. We were talking about 19th century women, but a good way of bringing it into the 21st century as well. But, things like the Normans and how they will be linked to broader themes, such as people have come to Britain up to the present day. So just think about, immigration. Ensuring that children are involved in developing their understanding of diversity through the process by which we teach it. We need to allow them to ask open questions of pictures and sources and not be too worried if we can't always provide the answer. There is a learning point in itself. For example, children can start by exploring the life of Elizabeth I and deciding what this tells them about the time. This could be followed by an exercise which looks at the experience of rich and poor people together with Black migrants in Tudor times. This can provide another opportunity to reflect on their perceptions of the time in which we live. So you're constantly making it relevant to them now. This will also enable them to have a more profound understanding of diversity in the past and actually challenge their own and others' misconceptions. Ensuring that children treat diversity historically. For example, a study of the suffragette movement could start by focusing on the life of Sophia Dulap Singh, who was an Indian princess who joined the Women's Social and Political Union. This could be followed by exploring the lives of other suffragettes and ensuring that children are aware that there are gaps and omissions in a variety of sources, e.g. textbooks and pictures, and that women and people from ethnic minorities are often either underrepresented or not acknowledged at all. So the ISEB history curriculum, we're very fortunate that the Common Entrance syllabus allows us the flexibility to explore areas of diversity and equality in more depth. It actually states that candidates may study events, issues, people, or places related to any of these areas. So suggested areas of study. If we start with the first suggested area, which is the medieval realms, 1066 to 1485, we'll start with the Crusades. If we have a look at the timeline of the Crusades, we can clearly show the causes of the religious wars, but it could be further developed to discuss other religious wars throughout history, including the English Civil War, the French Wars of Religion, the Afghan Civil War, the Bosnian War, the Troubles. And I think that is really important, that actually it's a little bit like going down a rabbit hole. You can go further and further, and you can get closer and closer to events that may be more tangible to them, ones that, even looking at events today, and looking around the world and looking where there be meaning for these children, to recognize that these themes do actually run through history, that it's not just a foreign, world, a foreign past. It actually has relevance today. William the Bastard, I always think, is a really interesting one. And, when we're looking at also Henry VIII and legitimacy, how attitudes have actually changed, and partnerships and families come in all forms now. And this term is rarely associated with being illegitimate. It just shows the progression and the acceptance, and how we're a much more accepting society, and we understand different types of relationships. You've got these resources, they have been sent to them, so please do actually look at some of these. But the Normans, immigration, focusing on the history of immigration in Britain, making comparisons with the people of the Windrush, coming into a completely foreign environment where, often you don't speak the language, you don't understand the culture. We are a country that has had many immigrants settle here. And it's just recognizing this is not just something that's happened in the modern age. This has been going on, even if we go back before to the Romans and even earlier, we've had people settle here. Women's history. Comparisons with modern leaders and the role of women in medieval times, making comparisons with modern times, but also the roles of mothers and grandmothers. You could get children to interview their grandmothers. I had a child in my class that their great-grandmother actually worked at Bletchley Park. I also had another grandmother that was born in India, and her father was an army officer, and her mother had been an Indian lady. And it was just wonderful because she talked about her own experience. We have a look at the video on the immigration of Normans and the cultural changes, give you just a flavor about what did the Normans do for us. It always reminds me of Life of Brian. What did the Romans ever do for us? What did the Normans ever do for us? And it reminds people that when you get people that come into a country, they bring with them a wealth of their experiences, their culture, and that actually enhances ours as well. So I think we're going to see that.
In the year 1066, 7,000 Norman infantry and knights sailed in warships across the English Channel. Their target, England, home to more than 1 million people. Theirs was a short voyage with massive consequences. And around the same period of time, other groups of Normans were setting forth all across Europe, going on adventures that would reverberate throughout that continent's history. So who were these warriors, and how did they leave their mark so far and wide? Our story begins over 200 years earlier, when Vikings began to settle on the shores of northern France as part of a great Scandinavian exodus across northern Europe. The French locals called these invaders Normans, named for the direction they came from. Eventually, Charles, the king of the Franks, negotiated peace with the Viking leader Rollo in 911, granting him a stretch of land along France's northern coast that came to be known as Normandy. The Normans proved adaptable to their newly settled life. They married Frankish women, adopted the French language, and soon started converting from Norse paganism to Christianity. But though they adapted, they maintained the warrior tradition and conquering spirit of their Viking forebears. Before long, ambitious Norman knights were looking for new challenges. The Normans' best-known achievement was their conquest of England. In 1066, William, the Duke of Normandy, disputed the claim of the new English king, Harold Godwinson. Soon after landing in England, William and his knights met Harold's army near the town of Hastings. The climactic moment in the battle is immortalized in the 70-meter-long Bayeux Tapestry, where an arrow striking Harold in the eye seals the Norman victory. William consolidated his gains with a huge castle-building campaign and a reorganization of English society. He lived up to his nickname, William the Conqueror, through a massive survey known as the Domesday Book, which recorded the population and ownership of every piece of land in England. Norman French became the language of the new royal court, while commoners continued to speak Anglo-Saxon. Over time, the two merged to give us the English we know today, though the divide between lords and peasants can still be felt in synonym pairs such as cow and beef. By the end of the 12th century, the Normans had further expanded into Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. Meanwhile, independent groups of Norman knights traveled to the Mediterranean, inspired by tales of pilgrims returning from Jerusalem. There, they threw themselves into a tangled mass of conflicts among the established powers all over that region. They became highly prized mercenaries, and during one of these battles, they made the first recorded heavy cavalry charge with couched lances, a devastating tactic that soon became standard in medieval warfare. The Normans were also central to the First Crusade of 1095 to 99, a bloody conflict that re-established Christian control in certain parts of the Middle East. But the Normans did more than just fight. As a result of their victories, leaders like William Ironarm and Robert the Crafty secured lands throughout southern Italy, eventually merging them to form the Kingdom of Sicily in 1130. Under Roger II, the kingdom became a beacon of multicultural tolerance in a world torn apart by religious and civil wars. Muslim Arab poets and scholars served in the royal court alongside Byzantine Greek sailors and architects. Arabic remained an official language along with Latin, Greek, and Norman French. The world's geographical knowledge was compiled in the Book of Roger, whose maps of the known world would remain the most accurate available for 300 years. And the churches built in Palermo combined Latin-style architecture, Arab ceilings, and Byzantine domes, all decorated with exquisite golden mosaics. So if the Normans were so successful, why aren't they still around? In fact, this was a key part of their success, not just ruling the societies they conquered, but becoming part of them. Although the Normans eventually disappeared as a distinct group, their contributions remained. And today, from the castles and cathedrals that dot Europe's landscape to wherever the English language is spoken, the Norman legacy lives on. Check out this lesson to learn more about how the Normans helped shape the English language.
So moving on to the making of United Kingdom, 1485 to 1750, the Historical Association has provided some good case studies here. And one of their case studies actually has a question: does learning about Elizabeth I tell us all we need to know about Tudor women? I mean, obviously, Elizabeth I was exceptional in her power and authority as a monarch, while other women in Tudor times were unable to do certain jobs, such as become lawyers or holding political power. However, surprisingly, rich women could be significant at court and play important roles in organising family estates and giving medical help to the poor. But there was that inequality between the classes. And again, it's interesting for the children to have a look at this. Poor women, however, did a range of jobs. They were silk makers, they were printers, they worked on the land and did shopkeeping, for example. So as stage one, you could select a picture of Queen Elizabeth I, ask some questions. What does this suggest about the lives of women in Elizabethan times? And they will come up with that they were wealthy, they were well dressed, they were powerful. But again, that's only looking at one artist's impression. It's only looking at one woman who was leading the country. Then you could look at 4 other pictures of other Elizabethan women and ask the question, what more do these tell you about the lives of Elizabethan women? And how typical was Queen Elizabeth I? Then another stage, you could create a grid with the following titles: rich, poor, jobs, punishment, power. And then the children could sort cards relating to different characteristics of women's lives in Tudor England. And these cards are one of the resources you can download on the Historical Association's website. Have a look at primary history schemes of work, the Elizabethans, and there's lots and lots of information there as well. You could get children to review a textbook or a school's website, I don't know, like the BBC Bite Size, to assess how accurately it reflects the diverse nature of women's lives in Tudor times. And as a review, you could say, how well does our study of Elizabeth I tell us about women's lives in Tudor time? One of the things that I've just joined is Future Learn, and there's some excellent resources on there. They've got the story of the Black Tudors, and it's a course and it is free, but it provides clips from historians and has contemporary material that you can use with your pupils. Not only does it have Black Tudors, it has other topics of interest as well, and it is free. I think we're going to just see a clip about
Hello and welcome to the Future Learn Black Tudors course. I'm Dr. Miranda Kaufman, author of Black Tudors, The Untold Story, which is the book that this course is based on. And I'm a historian interested in Black British history, particularly in the lives of Africans in Britain between the 16th and 18th centuries, colonial connections and the legacies of enslavement. And I'm delighted to be joined today by David Olusoga. David, could you just say a bit to introduce yourself?
I'm an historian and a television producer, and I'm the author of a book called Black and British. And I write about Black British history, about the British Empire, but also about the First World War and urban history. Miranda, can I ask you some questions about the course and about this subject? What first drew you to this subject of the Black Tudors?
Well, my mind wandered in a university lecture when it was quite a boring lecture about early modern trade, but then they suddenly said that the Tudors had started trading to Africa in the middle of the 16th century, which was so much earlier than what we'd briefly learned about at school about the trafficking of enslaved Africans in the 18th century. And so I had to find out more. I rushed to the library. I found, some of those seminal works by Peter Fryer, James Walvin, and suddenly found references to there actually being Africans in Tudor England, which was a whole other surprise. But there didn't seem to be a lot written about it. So I decided I had to go back to the original sources from the period and try and find out more. And I ended up, doing a whole doctorate on it and writing a book, and I'm still talking about it now.
And this course, can you tell me what this course covers?
Well, we're going to be looking at the topic of Africans in Tudor and early Stuart England, as I do in my book. In the book, we look really at the story through the lives of 10 individuals, and we will be meeting those individuals in the course as well. But we're also going to look at some of those bigger themes, ask those bigger questions about how Africans came to Britain and why, what their experiences were like here, and crucially, whether they were free or enslaved, and to what extent we can discern racial prejudice in this early period of that encounter between Africans and English people.
And so the learners who are interested in taking this course, what will they gain from the course?
Well, I think when you read a book, you sort of take it as read. And when you write a book, you have to kind of command an authorial voice and say, this is what happened. But in the course, we're going to sort of revisit those questions. You're going to be able to look at the original sources yourselves, read about what different historians, how they've interpreted it, look at all those different perspectives. And actually start to engage with those arguments yourselves, and in the discussion, discuss with other learners, what you think the significance of that evidence is.
So this is about how history is made rather than just telling history.
And showing everyone that they can be a historian too. I'm really pleased to be able to talk to you about it, David, because I think you've got that perspective of the broader sweep of Black British history and Black history globally. I mean, how do you see where Black Tudors fits in with that?
Well, I think one of the things that I think people find fascinating about the Black Tudors is one of the reasons why I think your work and the work of others has been so important, is that I think it does two critical things. One, it absolutely explodes the myth that Black people first came to Britain in the 1940s, the so-called Windrush myth. And that's still prevalent in the minds of some people, that this is a 20th century story. But I think it does something else. I think it shows that Britain's interactions with Africans begins at that moment in the 16th century and the 15th century, when Britain is both physically and in its imagination expanding its horizons, when England in particular, but also Stuart Scotland, is thinking about the Atlantic world and thinking about the world of Africa, a world that had been sort of cut off from Europe for a long time. So I think it places them in this moment of expansion, but also this moment of history that is one of the areas, the parts of the past that we are most fascinated by in this country.
Yeah, and I really hope it does give people that different, broader, kind of global take on the Tudors. And so there's so much to explore, and I think we both really hope that the learners enjoy the course.
I think if there's any part of English history and the history of Black people in England that should fire people's imagination, it's the fact that your work and the work of others has shown that there were Black people who had front row seats, as it were, in that great sort of melodrama that was Tudor England.
And this is the age of Shakespeare, and a period which people seem to be perennially fascinated about, but often they just hear the same old stories. And so it's exciting to be kicking off this in week one, looking at John Blank, who, as you say, kind of had that ringside seat at the courts of Henry VII and Henry VIII.
So John Blank, he was one of the trumpeters at the court of Henry VIII, and it does tell his life, and we've used it as storyboards and used some of the clips to actually complement the work in class as well. So moving on to Britain and the Empire, 1750 to 1900, some of the areas that you could actually explore is obviously the Indian Mutiny, thinking about reasons behind the mutiny. In class, get some of the children to be journalists, to be either an Indian or a British newspaper, and then some children to be interviewed from both British and Indian perspective, and discuss the differing versions and actually how we record them. Obviously, you've got some really significant social reformers, such as Florence Nightingale, Mary Seacole, Elizabeth Fry, Millicent Fawcett. One of the case studies that you could do is Florence Nightingale. Give the class an extract from Marshall's Our Island History and a picture of Florence Nightingale and her nurses, which was in the Cork Examiner in 1854. What does the picture suggest about the nurses out in the Crimea? Just using those observational skills. Then show a punch cartoon of Mary Seacole. The cartoon shows Seacole in an army hospital, selling or giving away magazine with no explanation that she didn't nurse in any army hospital. And the picture was a cartoon in a sort of humorous magazine, not a literal description. And she's shown at the bedside of a soldier. Discuss why she's not featured in a newspaper. Why there's very little recognition for her work in the Crimea before the 1970s. Her grave in St. Mary's Roman Catholic Cemetery was rediscovered in 1973 and then restored by the British Commonwealth Nurses War Memorial Fund. But it wasn't until 2007 that she was part of the national curriculum, and she was added, and her story for students. So using that as a discussion point again, if you go on to BBC Teach, there's a really, really good docudrama that's the life of Mary Seacole. And it shows her struggle against prejudice and her standing up, not just for, people of colour, but also for women as well. And then go back to Marshall's Island history and ask them, why isn't she included? And what is the role of a historian in recording history? And hopefully they'll be starting to make connections about the history that they read isn't always balanced. It isn't always the whole picture. And that's part of the sort of inquiry skills that you want them to be developing. So what I'd really like, I think, to finish in is I think it's all about sharing really good practice. How do we teach equality, diversity, and inclusion through the History Common Entrance syllabus? And I think it's really, really important to be sharing this good practice. And I was hoping that when we do the Q&A, I think we're just about time for the Q&A, that people can actually give some ideas to people like me as well, so that I can use them. I think it's really, really important. So if there's anybody out there that has some really good ideas, and then we can share them with the other people on the webinar, that would be amazing.
Absolutely. So we had some sent in beforehand, Claire, and thank you so much for that. It was really interesting. I got really quite into those, some of those clips, and learnt a lot myself. But yes, one of the questions was that as far as EDI goes, is there any call for really sort of almost exploring characteristic by characteristic, or do you think that really great history teaching should be a bit more organic than that? Sometimes I know that even I've heard sort of criticisms from teachers, or even as we're having setting meetings with people saying, oh, do we need to be careful about sort of tokenism? What might we say there?
Absolutely. I think it needs to be organic. I think it needs to be more natural, embedded into our schemes of work, rather than being a bolt-on. I think that that's the problem. I mean, obviously we do Black History Month, which is fantastic, but it does feel a little bit sometimes false. And why aren't we actually embedding it into the rich culture of our own country's history? There is so much there that we could be putting into our curriculums and focusing on, rather than just having it as a month, or for instance this week as women. I think that is something that people should be looking at in terms of their curriculum. I think definitely embedding it.
Brilliant. We've got another one here, which is, where can I go to for great resources on EDI?
Well, the Historical Association is really good. Actually, the BBC Bite Size and the BBC Teach is really, really good. Future Learn, I think, is a really good one. The other one I don't know whether people have looked at are the Harvard courses, and they have some free courses which can be really useful. But I actually think that going to visit other schools and looking at their curriculums and being able to have those conversations with other history teachers and sharing ideas, and hopefully I think that is the best way of extending good practice.
I've actually just had something come in here that says that Our Story Education is a brilliant place to go, apparently, as well, for some EDI resources. So a bit of crowdsource information. Is there, from a history perspective, if we're thinking about the examination, will specific questions on EDI come up?
Well, there's always a question on women. That tends to be the one. So when we're looking at the protected characteristics, it tends to be, the role of women in a particular period. So in that way, I mean, we obviously haven't diversified it any further, but there will be a question on gender.
Lovely. And also from your perspective, in terms of teaching history and trying to incorporate EDI and looking at that whole range of time periods, are there any topics you think are lesser studied that might be really great ideas for teachers to bring up? Because I know we often hear about, topics involving the Romans, and we know that it can be restrictive with an exam syllabus. But, are there any things, if teachers wanted to mix it up a bit, that you might suggest could be interesting?
So I suppose looking at world history and looking at other cultures, I know that lower down they do the Incas, they do the Aztecs, but perhaps even looking at the Aborigines, the Maoris, looking at their history as well, and looking at their struggle, as they have actually tried to embed their culture in what was perceived as very much a white history syllabus in those countries. So I think that would be exciting. And, I think that showing that struggle as well is important, and the path that hopefully now we're becoming more aware of, that inclusion and making sure that we are including all people's history.
That's, so interesting. I've got another couple coming in here. Will there be questions navigating intersectional diversity? So white feminism, how marginalized groups can oppress each other. I'm sure people don't know what they're talking about here, that's for sure. That's amazing.
I mean, of course, you can explore that within the syllabus. I don't think there would be specific questions on that. But as you know, these are skills that we're not just building for the Common Entrance exam. These are skills that we're building, hopefully, to create really good historians who want to go on and have a career in history. So all of this is important to explore beyond the curriculum. The curriculum is there, but as we know, as good teachers, you want to go beyond the curriculum. You want to actually be instilling knowledge and skills that's hopefully going to make them interested and passionate to want to continue to actually study their subject.
Lovely. I've got another one here. What areas of history or cultural study do you feel are neglected or underrated?
Well, I did say, when I'm looking at it, I think that, New Zealand and Australia are part of the Commonwealth and have been part of our journey. And we don't really do a huge amount of history on that side. We also don't really do a huge amount of history in Asia as well, which has a fascinating wealth of history. And I think it's broadening. We're global citizens now. It's broadening the children's horizons to understand that other countries have a rich history. It's not just ours. I mean, I suppose we do limit ourselves to British history, but if we can actually expand it and show how it might have influenced our history, doing the Crusades and having a look at the Arabic history and what impact it's had on ours is important as well.
Great, thank you. What else have I got? Bear with me. Should we incorporate contemporary criticisms of history as sources, as well as those from that time period? I.e., do we think it's useful to include sources from newspapers or from the media now, where people are beginning to talk about history in a completely new light, as well as that time period?
Yeah, I think it's important, but I think as history teachers, we have a duty of care to the children, and we just need to be careful where we're getting those sources from, not to politicize it too much. So I think that's the only thing I would say. But I think we're all experienced enough to actually filter through those and just make sure that we are trying to be as impartial as possible in our approach.
Lovely. No, that's really good advice. So we've got one from Adrian. The English Reformation gives us a good opportunity to look at Islamic history, Shia versus Sunni schism, and comparing it to Protestants versus Catholics.
Absolutely.
So thank you for that comment, Adrian. Sorry for mischaracterizing that as a question. We've got another one here. We know that the exam is key to helping us introduce new topics too. Will the exam be evolving to introduce these ideas?
I'm sure that exams evolve as time goes on. We've obviously just been through a slight evolution of the exam, but it is something that we continue to review. And I'm sure that we will be looking at including more topics as they become really more topical, you know, and it becomes more meaningful to the children. But there's so much you can do. I mean, obviously with the syllabus, and, you know, we don't want to overload teachers and we don't want to overload the students as well, and that's what we've done with the current common entrance syllabus. Is we've tried to simplify it really and make it easier for teachers to teach and the children to learn and also enjoy. I think that's the key as well. But it doesn't mean that you can't do beyond that. I would just say that you've got the syllabus, but actually there's syllabus, and you know, where they're just ripe for that curiosity and that information. So and beginning to really analyze, you know, both contemporary, you know, and modern sources. So I think that's really important.
Oh, thank you. So we've just had backstage, we actually have another one of our history setters with us, and he has suggested that there is also the option of American settlements for religious diversity and also treatment of natives, and that's already in the exam at the moment as well. But we had one question here, which is, how does the specification tackle source bias? You there, Claire?
Yes, have I frozen or have you frozen?
Sorry, it's just the most recent question was, how do we tackle source bias?
Is this in the specification for common entrance or in the context of EDI?
In the context of EDI, I think.
Well, I suppose it's exactly the same as you tackle source bias in the specification as well. You know, you look at the provenance of the source, you look at who's written it, when it was written, what the motives are behind it, and you actually analyze it on the basis of that, whether or not it's intentional, whether or not the author is using it for any sort of propaganda reasons. So you ask the usual questions of the source. I always say to the children, it's a bit like being at a murder scene. And what you're doing is you're putting that source on trial and you're asking the questions of it. Where were you? What were you doing? What did you say? You know, and I think that that's the best way actually to get the children engaged in it, to ask the questions. The source won't speak to you. You've got to drill down and you've got to ask questions.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. Well, what we're going to do is we've got a couple of minutes left. I'm just going to put a final call out for any questions coming in from YouTube. But while we do that, just to give you a huge thanks, Claire. Not only was that brilliantly informative, but I can just hear how passionate you are, not only in your teaching of this. I feel like we want to join one of your classes, but not only in the teaching of your subject, but in how you communicate that to us and bring us all along with you. So a huge thank you. I did allude to the fact that we had somebody with us backstage at the moment who is Bob Pace, who will be doing the next brilliant history session and works with Claire on all of the CE papers. So you're absolutely in brilliant hands if you would like to sign up for that second session. Bob is going to be talking to you not only about tackling the new specifications, but also the way in which we can teach history in a range of cross-curricular ways as well, to really bring history to life across the whole school. It doesn't just have to be about teaching history in your classroom at a specific time, but how perhaps project work, as I know Claire alluded to earlier, can be a great way to get everybody behind a range of topics that are really relevant to young learners. So yes, please do sign up for that. That's on Eventbrite again. And all those of you who are here, there is still an early bird discount on those, and you just sign up in the same way. I've got one just come in on my text notification here that says, last question, have you got a favorite underrated or little known fact from history, brackets, related to EDI or not? I love that question.
I think I referred to Pablo Fanck, who was a circus performer and ended up owning a circus in Victorian time. And there was a very famous quote actually by a white man at the time. And he said, where Pablo Fanck is concerned, there is no colour line. And I thought, gosh, people were actually challenging it even then. But do look him up because he is absolutely fascinating. You know, he really did fight against adversity and he was quite unique. And the fact that he was involved in the circus just makes it a little bit more exciting.
And is he, she says, perhaps about to disgrace herself at the very end of our first CPD session, is he the Pablo Fanck from Sergeant Pepper's Being for the Benefit of
Absolutely. Yes, he is. Yeah, he is. So I play that. And actually, that's quite fun because then I play the Beatles song as well when we're actually, you know, studying him. So a little bit of a cross-curricular going on there.
Really? Well, there we go. The Beatles taught me something and I didn't even know they had until I was older.
There you are. Look him up.
Thank you so much, Claire, and thanks all of you for joining us. The next history session will be in June, and as I say, do sign up on Eventbrite now. We can't wait to have you here. You will get to meet Bob Pace, who is our lead setter, but I'm sure you will join me all in thanking Claire for a really informative session from a hugely passionate teacher and historian. So thank you very much, and we really look forward to seeing you all next time.
Been a pleasure.